So just by way of quick introduction, the rabbi approached me, I don't know, a month ago, 6 weeks ago, and told me that he was planning to do this, and he asked me to serve in this role of doing this interview. And I immediately said, if I'm in town, I'm going to do it. And luckily, I'm in town. And I'm really looking forward to it because in my past life as a producer in broadcast journalism, I love doing interviews. And I love asking questions. And I think there's an art to asking good questions. And the rabbi and I have been having conversations since 1995, I guess, when I joined the synagogue. I was never one to feel like if I had something to say to him, I wasn't shy about it. And we've had some pretty good chats over the days. And some of them ended with, we'll just agree to disagree, but that's okay. So I'm glad you're all here. And let's get going. Well, the one thing I did want to say is we did chat yesterday, just in general, about what we were going to do. But I told the rabbi that I would rather not give him the questions and treat this like a real sort of newsy interview. Because in those days in my life, people would always ask, oh, can I know the questions? And the answer was always no, right? You never give questions to a newsmaker before you do the interview. At least we didn't. So just FYI, that's why we tried to make this as authentic as possible. So I want to start, the first question is, why are we doing this tonight? Why did you feel this was important to do?
Thank you. It's an opportunity for me to share with the members of the congregation thoughts and reflections. You know, when some of the other senior rabbis had retired, Rabbi Kahan and Rabbi Simon and Rabbi Haberman, some of you may remember, there were 3 senior rabbis of 3 major congregations. I actually interviewed them after they had retired, and I was surprised to learn that no one in their congregation had ever done that. And I thought it's an opportunity for me just to kind of, you know, let my hair down, that which is left of it, and to be able to share perspectives and retrospective. I was ordained as rabbi in 1979. I entered rabbinical school in 1974. So it's time to think a little bit and look back.
I think, except for maybe 1 or 2 people who are here tonight, everybody only knows you as Rabbi Weinblatt.
Right.
But before there was Rabbi Weinblatt, there was just regular old Stuart Weinblatt. Who was Stuart Weinblatt?
Wow. See, I didn't know the questions in advance. Okay. As many of you know, I grew up in Baltimore. I went to in Pikesville, which is an area which was, until I got past 6th grade, I thought the whole world was Jewish. I really did. And so I grew up in a very Jewish milieu, a very Jewish environment. When I went to high school, I was involved in a number of different things, including, I'll tell you, I started something called the Student Involvement Committee. And the administration at the time, this was in 1968, 69, so you know what was going on in those days, did not like it being called the Student Involvement Committee. So, I wanted to call it the Student Action Committee. Mm-hmm. And they were afraid that it was too pregnant of a term. And so they said, you can't call it the Student Action Committee. So I said, okay, how about the Student Involvement Committee? And they said, fine. And I also was making the morning announcements at the time. So I would announce and say, there'll be a meeting this afternoon of all sick students. And so on. So I was involved in those kinds of things. I'd worked a couple of summers on Capitol Hill. I had done different political kinds of things in college, but I was always in touch with my Jewish identity, and that was an important part of who and what I was before becoming a rabbi, and was just a regular person until I became a rabbi.
So then that got erased.
Yeah.
When did you first know that being a rabbi was your calling,
yeah.
And how did that calling reveal itself to you?
So what happened was, it was my last year of college, which was 73 to 74, and the Yom Kippur War broke out in October of 73. I briefly alluded to this on the high holidays. And with that, I was so worried about the survival and existence of the state of Israel. It was hanging by a thread. And I came to realize then that that was more important to me, the survival of Israel, Judaism, and the Jewish people than anything. Now I say that because I had really been pursuing a path which could very easily have taken me in a political direction. I was the Director of State Affairs for the University of Maryland students for 3.5 years, which meant I lobbied the Maryland state government. I had contacts, and I would speak before the state legislature. I'd meet with the governor, and I had held news conferences. I ran a voter registration drive at the University of Maryland, where we registered 9,000 young new registered voters in a period of a year, which was extraordinary, and all this other kind of things. So that could have been the path. I did think a little bit about comedy writing and stand-up comedy, because I was doing some of that as well. And then, after the Yom Kippur War, it all fell in place. There were two or three other quick things I should mention. That was, I happened to be teaching in a Sunday school in Laurel, Maryland, and I loved it so much. I also was taking a couple of Jewish studies classes, and that was wonderful. One of them was with my teacher, the late Dr. Sam Avery. His son Mark is here tonight, and Dr. Avery, I think, was one of the first to suggest I think about becoming a rabbi, because I had written a paper on biblical analysis and literary and historical analysis, and he said, Weinblatt, he was from Poland, he says, Weinblatt, you should think about this. And so I thought about it, and then things just kind of fell in place. I thought about, what is it a rabbi gets to do? Number one is to be an advocate for Judaism and the Jewish people. You get to teach. I love that. I love the interaction with people. I love the opportunity to counsel. You know, many people see the public side of me on the Bima or elsewhere, but there are many conversations that take place in someone's home, sometimes late at night, sometimes in my office, of people dealing with different situations, and I find that all very meaningful. So I looked at all those different things and realized I think this might be my calling.
You know, you were raised in a Reform
That's
household,
right, yeah.
and you were originally ordained as a Reform rabbi.
Yeah.
What was the impetus to go from Reform to conservative, and what was that move like?
So I grew up at Baltimore Hebrew congregation. Here in Washington, the franchise is called Washington Hebrew. Not a franchise, just kidding. So I grew up at Baltimore Hebrew, and in a Reform congregation, and my family belonged to the synagogue, but we had a kosher home. We made Kiddush and lit candles every Friday night. Shabbat was special. So, and I went to services with my dad on festival mornings. So there was positive Jewish influences. I have to mention, by the way, that also my grandmother, Allah HaShalom, was a very strong influence in many respects, just a love of Yiddishkeit and of the Jewish people, and was a very special person. So with all of that, I thought originally you could be as traditional as one wants to be in the Reform movement. But over the years, I found that wasn't really very tenable. In fact, Ezra, when he was 9 years old, we were at my previous synagogue, and he was there, and he wanted to get something to eat. I said, well, just make sure you don't take anything out of the refrigerator because nothing's kosher. And he said, Dad, how come the synagogue kitchen isn't kosher? I was like, you got a point there. And so there were a series of things where I began to say, wait a minute, am I really comfortable? And then a big part of it was in the late 80s. The Reform movement was bashing Orthodoxy and also Israel a lot. Mm-hmm. And I just felt that wasn't tenable. I wasn't comfortable with that. Finally, there was an emphasis in Reform Judaism, which exists to this day, on individual autonomy, which means every Jew decides what they want to do, how much, and this and that. The reality is, everybody's going to make that decision. You know, even among Orthodox Jews, I've yet to meet, as I've said before, 2 Jews who keep kosher the exact same way. So everybody implements. But if that's the foundation, it doesn't leave enough for continuity, for community, which I thought was more important. So it was in that time period, 86, 87, I was ordained in 79. My first 2 years, I was an assistant rabbi in Miami, came up to Bowie. I was on my own for 7 years. I thought, I'm set. I could be, on a nice path for a nice, large Reform congregation and everything. And I just realized, you know what? I'm not going to be happy. I have to say one other thing. Yes. I mentioned about Rabbi Josh Haberman, who many of us may remember him from Washington Hebrew. When I was starting to think about making this change to the conservative movement and starting a conservative synagogue, I went and I met with him. He had just announced his retirement, and he said to me, I wish I would have done what you're doing.
Wow.
And I was in my 30s at the time, and I said, you know what? I don't want to look back on my life and say, coulda, shoulda, woulda. And so that was also an important factor. So all of these things kind of fell in place, Arnie. And then in 87, 88 is when we started to take the initial steps to look to form a congregation. Last thing is there were people who had always said to me, since I was in Bowie, which is really Jennisveld, all the way in the other end of town, it's a shame you're not out here in the thick of where the greater Jewish population is. So that's how it all fell in place.
In these early days and years of your career development, what role did Simcha play in support? I mean, obviously she supported you, but tell me a little bit about how that played out and how that aided you.
So it was very interesting. First of all, so you have to realize at the time we had 3 kids, and then, you know, we talked considerably about this idea, and she was extremely supportive, which is amazing because, as I said, we had 3 children at the time, and I was going to start a synagogue which had 0 members, and even less of a possibility of getting anywhere. And she said, let's go for it. She knew I was not happy in the reform movement. I could have, as I said, taken an easy career path, and she was very supportive. And the ways in which she was supportive was, first of all, in terms of encouraging. In addition to that, she was a great connector to meet some people and say, you know, she would say, oh, Stuart, I got somebody who's going to be a great teacher in your religious school. That was Diana Siegel. There was somebody else, it was Jill Weinstein, one of the first people she met. She said, Stuart, I got somebody, she's going to be a great organizer. And Jill had some of the early meetings that we had and so on. So in that way, and then finally, you know, before we had a building, anything, we held things either at the Potomac Community Center or the JCC or elsewhere. But there was a lot of stuff we did in my house. So we would have board meetings at my home. We built a sukkah in my backyard, and Simcha was amazing as Hachnasat Orchim, welcoming people, bringing them in, and really providing that atmosphere, I think, which was so helpful. And so in countless other ways, I would have to say, yeah.
My first time attending a service that you led was at the JCC when Bonnie and I were shul shopping.
Yeah.
And that was my first connection.
Right, that would have been one of the high holidays in one of the early years there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was. So let's progress a little bit to the formation of CBT. Mm-hmm. You talked a little bit about that early period. And I'm curious, I know it wasn't right here, it was kind of over there because the building expanded. But the first service in this building, you're on the Bima, the first service that you started, what was going through your head?
Wow. I hope the electricity doesn't conk out. And
Did you hope the bill got paid?
because in one of our early services, it did conk out, as a matter of fact. But it was pretty thrilling. I tell you, take it back even before that, Artie. We were meeting in different locations. If I could just go back for a second. So we had...
was it something at the Ring House?
Yeah, we were at the Ring House as well. You know, when we had our 25th anniversary of B'nai Tzedek, we did a bike loop of all the different places where we had met, including what was Harker School, which is now was it St. Andrew's Episcopal, I believe, and other. It was a 25-mile route that we did. We didn't go to my former house, but anyway, we went and we did this loop, and so we had a phone installed at my house that rang just for the synagogue, and again, I've got 3 in it. That's by then 4 small kids, and you know, in the middle of dinner, whatever it was, the phone would ring, and I, you know, have to rush to get it, and. There was one time, in those days, we sold high holiday tickets just to get out at the JCC. That's how we got you. So one time, somebody called, and I had to answer the phone, and they said, you know, can you tell me how much your high holiday tickets cost? And I'm like on the phone, okay. So I'll give them the answer.
Do it all.
This is MS. This is true. And the guy on the other line, I don't remember exactly who it was, but I'm not going to tell you. The guy on the other line says to me, you know what? It's less expensive. It's cheaper at B'nai Israel.
That's chutzpah.
So I said to him, literally, I said to him, we will meet or beat any shul's price. I did. So.
You're like Crazy Eddie.
Yeah, and then, exactly. And then, by the way, I should say, we put some great ads in the Washington Jewish Week as well. In that first year, there were like about, I don't know, 13 kids who were born, and we only had like 4 members. No, we had a little more. But we had 13 kids who were born, so I came up with the idea to put all the kids on my lap, and we ran an ad in the Jewish Week, and it said, the Bar and Bat Mitzvah class and Rabbi Weinblatt of, the Bar and Bat Mitzvah class of 57, 49, 89, whatever, and Rabbi Weinblatt invites you to come grow with us. And we put some ads to get people's attention
great.
and things like that. So people started talking a little bit about us. But what I want to say was, so we went from that situation then to being, we had offices at the White Flint Mall, Alav Shalom. We had offices also on Executive Boulevard. And then here, and I can go into, there's some interesting stories about those things as well. But then we came here, which is a long answer. I didn't even answer your question. So when we started to build the synagogue,
Right.
Noam at the time was about 3 or 4 years old, and we would come and see the progress, and then we had a dedication, a groundbreaking ceremony. So when he was little, he always used to refer to this as dirt services. That's what he called the shul. And so that's how it was. And we started with the, many may or may not know, but the building ended
Right,
over
the
there.
Bima was over there.
Exactly. So it was half the size, and within maybe about 4 years of being in the building is when we needed to expand it and double the size.
You are the founder of this institution. To what degree do you see yourself as the steward, not Stuart, the steward of Congregation B'nai Tzedek, and what does that term mean to you?
It means, as my son Mika once said, that what you do is quality control. In terms of just, worrying about every aspect to make sure that what we put out is going to be something that I'm going to be proud of, that I think our members demand a certain level of excellence. And in that context, I've always said, I think, I become a better rabbi because of our congregants. And so to me, it means caring for every aspect as well as the members of our staff, but also the members of the congregation, to be there for them in a personal way, at various life cycle events in people's lives, which is a personal interaction kind of thing. Right. And then when you say it in the context of the synagogue, it's broader. Those who have served as president or on the board especially would know the small little details that I try and make sure that things are taken care of and going well. That's what it means to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the roles that you play here in a very robust way is as a teacher, which is where the term of your title comes from.
Right.
Why is teaching so important to you?
I love teaching. First of all, Judaism is my passion, and to be able to share that, to convey that to people, it is, when I was in my previous congregation, there was someone who owned a store, and he said to me, Stuart, I'd love to have you work for me. He says, you're a good salesman. And I said, well, it's because I love the product. And so the product, I said I couldn't work for you, but the product is Judaism. And I think it is so inspiring. It has, there are times I'll just read over a text or whatever, and it would just get to me. And so I love being able to share that. Just this morning, I had my Torah study class, and helping what is an ancient text come alive, seeing how the questions that we have today were asked by rabbis of thousands of years ago, speaks to me in terms of the vibrancy, the relevancy of Judaism. And I have to admit, in many respects, I'm obsessed with Jewish survival and worried about Jewish survival, especially in terms of the future generation and the future of Judaism in America, and not just because of all the anti-Semitism which is going on, but because of our assimilation. So anything I can do to try and convey that and teach that, impart it, is very exciting.
What would you say is the most rewarding aspect of your time at B'nai Tzedek, and what's been the most disappointing or frustrating aspect of your time at B'nai Tzedek?
So I'll answer the second part first. Did any of you hear me say it on the high holidays? I actually said it.
I did.
Yeah, I said it. And what I referred to was that I wish I would have been more successful in terms of building a sense of community within the context of a worship community, of a more observant community. Now, I wasn't saying that to get strokes or things like that, but a few people afterwards did privately message me and say, hey, you've moved me along the way, which was comforting to hear. But that's an area that's been frustrating, and I also wrote not too long ago, and I said I'm pleased that everyone, so many people, tell me how much they enjoy my writings and sermons, and they send it around, which I love, and it's great. I mean, I've gotten emails from people in South Africa who told me that the sermon I gave was forwarded to them, which is amazing. But I said, I'd love for you to come and hear it live and be here, you know? So that's the part that's frustrating, and the part that's rewarding would be almost the flip side of that, to look what we have done.
Yeah.
To look at the vibrant community we've created, the sense of a congregation which shares a love of Judaism, which is definitely there, and a love for the Jewish people and for Israel. Remember when I said I wanted to become a rabbi because of those three issues? And I think that we have that. You know, I was extremely proud when we had the rally in Washington here in November. And we had close to 500 people who were there.
It was awesome.
There were about 300, over 300 in our immediate group. And over there, even just yesterday, somebody said to me, oh yeah, we were there, and I had no idea they were. And so that's permeated. I've loved also the teaching. I've loved the trips I've led. We've had some extraordinary, wonderful trips. You and I went on one of them. To
The Federation trip during the Second Intifada.
During the Second Intifada,
when we thought it can't get worse than this.
Right, right. You know, the Jewish pessimist says things can't get worse, and a Jewish optimist says, oh yes, they can. So
we're living that.
Yeah. So the aspect of being able to convey that and being able to share that passion, that love, and I guess the other thing is so many of the personal relationships that have developed have been so meaningful and rewarding and fulfilling.
You mentioned the reach that you have, whether somebody gets a sermon forwarded to them or they're watching on Zoom.
Right.
What is your sermon writing process? Right. I envision you scribbling on a little napkin sometimes.
Yeah.
And how do you know that you've hit a home run?
So when I started in rabbinical school, and then in my early years, in my previous congregations, my parents had a condo in Ocean City. And so I would go there in the summertime and sit on the beach with a yellow legal pad. And the best time of day would be at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, just as everyone was coming up from the beach. And it would just be a certain quietude that would exist there, and I would write there. And then, eventually, with the advent of computers, I was worried that there was something about this process. Any of us who've been involved in that may recall that as well. And wow, that really helped to shorten the process, because you could literally cut and paste. I used to literally cut and paste, but now you could on a computer. So in terms of the process, it's a bunch of things. Number one, the high holiday is unique. The high holidays are unique.
Is it because you have a full house?
Yeah. It's a full house. And there's sometimes I've given a message on a regular Shabbat, and it has a nice impact. I say, wow, if I would have given this on the high holidays, you know, or vice versa. Sometimes I give a sermon on the high holidays, and I thought it was pretty good, but people, you know, I got a really strong response, and I think it's because of that energy.
Yeah. You
know, people are looking for that message. So for the high holidays, I think about it all year round. I have a couple of files, sometimes, I mean, a little bit less so now, but I used to like cut newspaper articles, now so much is on the internet and so on. But I would just throw things in there. A perfect example is I gave a sermon a number of years ago, and I was waiting for the right opportunity to give the sermon. The German word, Schadenfreude, where you know, you take joy in someone else's mispleasure. I had that concept for about 5 years until finally I found enough material to be able to give that sermon. I gave it the year of Martha Stewart's trial.
Oh, when she went to jail?
When she went to jail, and so many people were so excited about that. So so that was the hook. So what I try and do is I think about themes. Sometimes I'll see a story, an anecdote, something that happens in the paper, something I read about, and I think, you know, that's good, and so I save that. So I think about it all year round, and then what happens is in June I start to pull it together a little bit. In July I begin to panic and say I have nothing to say, and I've said it all, and what am I going to do? And by the way, you know, when we're students, we have that dream of coming to the exam and not having studied.
Being prepared.
Okay. Yeah. Can I begin to tell you how many times I've dreamt? I'm standing here giving the about to give the sermon, and I left my sermon on my desk at home. And it actually, I'll tell you a funny story about that in a second. But so that recurring, during there. But so then, and then usually in August is when I really start to crunch it. That's in terms of the high holidays. And in each one of the high holiday sermons, I now have it down to between 20 to 40 hours. It used to be about 40 hours, which is a whole working week. And there are times I've given as many as 5 of those throughout the high holidays.
Right.
And then a regular Shabbat sermon is those are much quicker. I'm able to write those usually in about between 2 to 2.5 hours. And there again, sometimes people often ask, sometimes I have the idea and I look in the text. Sometimes I'm reading the text, something jumps out at me, but I'm looking at a lot of different texts. The last thing I'll say about it is I try and get a different book each year about the Parshat HaShavua, the weekly Torah portion, just to make sure that I'm fresh and things like that. Real quick, I'll just mention a number of years ago when the computer stuff was relatively new. Long story short, it was 4:30 on Yom Kippur afternoon, and my sermon totally disappeared.
Oh, God.
I could not find it anywhere at all. I looked on, it was, with the floppy disk, I was using that, and this and that, looked at it, and then I realized at that point, okay, and I've been working on it for all these hours. I said, Art, I just got to do the best I can to try and remember it. And I typed as quickly as I could, as much as I could. That year, Simcha made dinner for me as I drove to the shul and ate as I was driving to the shul to get here because I didn't have time to sit down with the family. And it was funny because I don't sometimes I tell the kids what I'm going to talk about, sometimes I don't, and so on. One of the things I don't do is, do you mind if I tell? I don't tell the jokes to Simcha in advance because she has an Israeli sense of humor and I have an American sense of humor, so but anyway, so I get here and and then at the last minute, I mentioned one of the things I was going to do in the sermon, and Mark Lee came up to me and said, "Dad, did you remember to include such and such?" I said, "Oh, I forgot. That's great." And so I was able to work that in. But that was really panicky. That's the only time that happened. Yeah.
Well, hopefully that'll never happen
Yeah,
again.
yeah.
I just want to transition a little bit to the topic of Israel. And I'm curious, at what point in your career, in your life and career, did Israel become the passion that it is that we see from you almost every day?
I mentioned my grandmother. The love of Yiddishkeit, Jewish people, definitely comes from her in many respects. I was in, I think it was maybe 9th grade or so, when the 6-Day War broke out. Lived in Baltimore. Again, I alluded to this briefly in a sermon recently. And my dad brought me to the Lafayette Square, right in front of the White House, for a big demonstration. It's the first time I saw people wearing yarmulkes. First time I heard Am Yisrael Chai, people be proud to be Jewish. That had quite an impact. So the 6-Day War. Then I went to college. And, in between, I should mention, I went to a Jewish summer camp.
Right.
The camp I went to, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of it at the time, it was outside of Annapolis. It's called Habonim Camp Mosheva. It was a labor Zionist youth movement camp. In those days, labor Zionism was Golda Meir, David Ben-Gurion, and those people. Today, it's actually moved considerably further to the left. It's probably left of Meretz. So I wouldn't be going there today. However, it instilled in me a pride of being Jewish and a love of Israel and things like that. Then we had the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War. Prior to that, I've been involved in Soviet Jewry demonstrations as a student in college. And so it all kind of fell in place, and that was when I was so concerned about the survival of Israel, and that's really kind of the trajectory. The first time I went to Israel was between my junior and senior year, which was of college, which would be summer of '73. And again, that's prior to the Yom Kippur War, which broke out in October.
A couple of months.
And so I took a couple of classes, summer classes there, and I thought to myself, wow, this is really such an unbelievable place. I really just fell in love with Israel when I was there.
Right.
And I said, it's a shame I'm not going to be coming back that often. Exactly.
Little did you know.
Over between like 50 to 60 times. But that also was a seminal moment as well.
And when did you decide that speaking passionately and directly about Israel advocacy was going to be a significant part of your rabbinic persona?
I think when I saw how Israel's portrayed in the media, and the need to dispel misinformation,
Right.
the importance of getting out a message because of the fact that it's not getting out there. And so I just felt it was so necessary. Again, it was, as I've said to other rabbis, we are advocates for Jewish life. We're advocates for living Judaism. We're advocates for mitzvot. I think we need to be advocates for the Jewish people as well. And that entails about half our people are in Israel, as well as the historic connection that we have to it.
Right. There are those who would say the Bima is not the place for political sermons, lecturing,
Right.
even discussion. How do you respond to that?
I agree with that. And that's why a number of years ago, I gave a sermon which I said, there's a whole controversy about whether or not rabbis should speak about political issues. Sure. And I specifically said, I'm not going to speak about any political issues tonight. I'm going to speak about the importance of support for Israel. And I define that as not being political, because it is part, as I said a moment ago, it's part of our identity, it's part of who and what we are, and that's why I think it's important. Now, and I also have never publicly criticized Israel from the Bima. That's very different, because sometimes people said, oh, why don't you criticize Israel? I said, it gets plenty of criticism. It doesn't mean me for that. But in an individual context, perhaps I would express private thoughts or something like that. But as a rabbi, I think part of our role is to help to dispel what's out there in the New York Times, the Washington Post, which has been atrocious the last 6 months, and CNN and elsewhere. Right. So that's part of where it comes from, Marty.
So playing off that, plays right into my next question, that you've taken your Israel advocacy as a rabbi to the next level as the founder of the Zionistic Rabbi Coalition. Why did you feel the need to take that step?
What happened with that, I'll tell you what happened, and that is that Israel's ambassador, first of all, being here in Washington, I've been very pleased to have a relationship with most of the Israeli ambassadors. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure, but I think we might be the only synagogue that can say every Israeli ambassador since we've opened has been here. Right. At B'nai Tzedek. And so I was especially close with Ambassador Ron Dermer. He had approached me a number of years ago and had said, Stuart, I'm worried about the lack of support for Israel among non-Orthodox rabbis. Can you do something and I'll help you, and so on and so forth. And I said to him, you don't need me to do that. I said, AIPAC has the staff, the resources, they're doing it. And so I said no. Then the United States announced they were moving the embassy to Jerusalem, right, and that we're going to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And the Reform movement came out with a statement that was not supportive of that at all. The conservative movement was supportive, but also Mittendrin and it schlepped in the Palestinian issue, which had nothing to do with anything of this particular declaration there. And so I was with Ambassador Dermer, and he said to me, Stuart, you know what, I'm worried about this drift from the non-Orthodox movements away from Israel and Jerusalem. I mean, that's central to the Jewish people. Will you do something about it? And I said to him, that's different. I said, before you were talking about political issues, now you're talking in the context of Jewish peoplehood. And so with that, then we took the first step. He asked me to take 12 non-Orthodox rabbis to Israel. He says, I'll set up meetings for you with the foreign ministry, with the prime minister, and so on. And he opened all kinds of doors. And but instead of taking 12, I took 21, just a little dyslexic. And then, and instead of just non-Orthodox rabbis, I included Orthodox rabbis as well. And then out of that, many of the colleagues said, our national movements aren't speaking for us. The knee-jerk reaction is to be critical of Israel, and then to complain why Israel isn't talking to us and listening to our movements. So out of that, I came to feel, you know what, this isn't just a one-off. We really need to get together. And so we now have several hundred rabbis who have joined. Right. We have a conference that's going to be coming up, our third annual conference. And with that, we've met with the prime minister twice. We've met with the president of Israel in a private meeting as well. The UAE invited us as their guests to come to celebrate the Abraham Accords and so on. So I felt there was a strong need for that, and have been very excited about this opportunity because so many rabbis are responding that we really need this.
I feel like it's impossible not to address October 7th. I was at a wedding out of town on October 7th, and I know I've already talked to you privately about what that morning was like here. but those first few days, what was that like for you? What was that like for your family? You guys have so much family in Israel.
Yeah.
What were those first few days like for you?
It was, I think, like all of us. It was first the shock, the disbelief, the horror, the sense of, so many of the platitudes that we've heard that seemed like they were just sound bites were true. What am I referring to? The thing, it may have been Golda Meir who had said, but maybe it was someone else who said, if Israel were to, if the Arabs were to lay down their weapons for a day, nothing would happen.
Right.
But if Israel were to lay down its defenses for a day, it would be overrun. And we saw that. And we saw the intensity of the hatred, the animosity, the raping, the pillaging, the looting, the killing, the murdering, the burning, all of this going on, this pogrom. It was so horrifying, Artie. And we were just consumed by it. I think the phone was glued to Simcha's hand because she was just getting updates, throughout the day, throughout those days. And each story was worse than the next. So we were all devastated by it. I mean, I'll just digress for a moment to say we, after, about 3 weeks afterwards, it's a long story, but I'll just cut to the chase and say that we, as a family, got away. We had a trip planned and we weren't going to do it. We did it, et cetera, et cetera. So it was Simcha, me, and our 4 kids. We were sitting down at dinner, and it was Ezra, and we were just all so, Ezra said, let's not talk about what happened on October 7th. Let's try and then 5 minutes later, he starts talking about October 7th. Because it was so much a part of our lives, we couldn't. And then those initial times, since October 7th, not all, but probably 3/4 to 80% of the sermons I've given have touched upon that, especially those opening days. And it goes back to, that was so fulfilling to see. Our congregation was so filled. People wanted to come. They wanted to be here. Just like after the Pittsburgh synagogue at the Tree of Life, the synagogue was filled. But I have to say, when you ask me about the disappointment, it should still be full. And people should still be coming. We're not past October 7th. We still earn mourning. I was speaking with a member of Congress not too long ago who said, we've got to talk about this two-state solution. I said, it's too early to talk about that. I said, we are still in mourning. And so we should still be coming together as a community to draw strength from each other and all. And so there was this tremendous outpouring, but I have to say, and I don't think I'm going to say anything, I said it then, I don't think I'm saying anything new. Unfortunately, I knew it would not be long-term. Right. And we certainly have seen that now. And it is just astounding and incomprehensible what's going on. That Israel is attacked by Hamas with their genocidal intentions, and instead, Israel becomes the bad guy. An article I've played around, or a sermon I've played around writing in my head, which I haven't really completed the thought on yet, is...
There's still time.
Yeah. Is the notion... remember when we were kids and somebody would call you a name, how would you respond? You would say, I'm rubber and you're glue. Whatever you say bounces off of me and sticks to you. That's Hamas. In other words... When Hamas is the one who committed genocide, Hamas is the one who is limiting free speech, Hamas is the one that is committing atrocities. But if it's bouncing off of them and sticking to us somehow.
I'm going to combine my next 2 questions. Because of everything that's going on that we see in the news every day, and we all know that a lot of these protests that we're seeing at college campuses, it's Jewish students to some extent, to a large extent, that are leading the protests. What would you want to say to them? And what do you say to somebody who says, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist?
Right. I happen to think that in a post-Holocaust world, and I felt this even in the 80s and 90s, in a post-Holocaust world, it's no longer fashionable to say you're anti-Semitic. And so it's convenient then to say, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. I'll be even in 1975 or so, wrote a wonderful op-ed piece in the New York Times at a time when they would print, allow pro-Israel stuff to get into the New York Times. And he talked about the fact that Israel is really the Jewish, I forgot exactly how to put it, but it's basically the Jewish state is the amplification of a Jew, and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism really come from the same, are from the same place.
Right, right.
So if someone claims that, and then there are a lot of people say, oh, well, I'm just critical of Israel, or sometimes they want to say I'm critical of Israel, I'm just critical of the government, but not this and that. And I think people are really just wordsmithing, and I think they're playing with us.
Right,
I think there's a reality of all the nations of the world, the only one that needs to justify its existence constantly is Israel. The only one that's under constant threat is Israel. The only one that's condemned in the way that it is constantly is Israel. So at some point, there was a Secretary General of the United Nations who had this inane statement. I think it might have been Utan, but I'm not 100% sure, who once said, it was Kofi Annan. Mm-hmm. Kofi Annan, who once said, something along the lines, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something along the lines, if everybody feels this way about Israel, maybe there's some truth to it. He actually said that.
Great.
That's the head of the United Nations, So,
Amazing.
And I hearken back to a phrase from Pirkei Avot that's always inspired me.
Yeah.
When I was a kid in high school, actually, I had this on my notebook. And the phrase is, B'makom she'en anashim, hishtadel liot ish. In a place where there are no men, strive to be a man. And what I took that always to mean is, sometimes it means you might not be popular, you might not be going with everyone, but you've got to rise above it. I think that's the story of the Jewish people in so many respects. So when you ask about the current milieu and environment of people being anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist, I think we have to, just make sure we're educated, make sure we're advocates, and make sure we are outspoken. The other part of your question, you asked about Jewish students being involved in some of this stuff, which makes no sense whatsoever. And part of that is the fault that Judaism has really two aspects we emphasize. One is the particularistic aspect of Judaism, and the other is the universalistic. And it really was captured in the phrase by Hillel, quoted in Pirkei Avot, when he said, "Ein ani li mili," if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Ukishani li ma'ani. If I'm only myself, then what I'm only for myself, what am I? And then he ended it, V'im lo kshav ematai, and if not, now when? So the first part of the sentence reminds us, and that comes first, we have to worry about ourselves. The second part talks about our responsibility to others. It's why I was so very proud in the late 1970s when Southeast Asia was falling apart.
Right.
And there were the boat people coming out of Laos and Thailand and Cambodia and Vietnam. The United States, even though these were our allies, turned these people away. The first country to accept them was Israel. Its Prime Minister Menachem Begin made an unbelievable statement. He said, "We Jews know what it means to be boat people. And we know what it means to have the doors closed on us. We will accept them." A few years ago, Simcha and I met one of these, the child of one of these people who she was a Asian woman, and she eventually had converted to Judaism through her, et
This
cetera,
was
et cetera.
in Israel?
In Israel, yeah. And she, she was one of the people who'd come over on one of these boats. So that's the universalistic aspect of it. And Elie Wiesel once said, when a Jew is, we as Jews are most human when we are most particular, most Jewish. So I think that what's happened is, for all too many, and I hold many rabbis guilty of this,
right.
We've emphasized tikkun olam, we've emphasized social action, we've emphasized universalism, we've emphasized our responsibility to others, and we've neglected that first part of Hillel's statement.
At ourselves.
Yes, yeah.
Interesting. All right, this is going to be my last question on this topic, and then I want to move on to retirement. So stand by.
Okay.
But seriously, to what degree would you say that we are right now living in the hardest time to be a Jew in America in your lifetime?
Totally. There are things that are happening that I never in my wildest dreams ever dreamed what was possible. When I was growing up, when most of us were growing up, the extent of anti-Semitism was a negative stereotype about Jews, somebody calling us tight or cheap or things like that, or
right.
Putting. I remember hearing someone put a penny on the floor and say, "Oh, look, all this kind of garbage." But that was it, for the most part. But now there is, although I'm told, by the way, the anti-Semitism was always there and so on and so forth. But the way it's as if the lid has been taken off of it, and so we see the anti-Semitism on the right. And we see it on the left,
Exactly.
and that's where they are coming together. We see it among the fascist, neo-fascist right. We see it among the elite far left, and we see it among Islamic fundamentalists as well. So all of that is converging, and it is frightening. I mean, I hear it from congregants. I see it. I feel it. You can't help but feel this way. College campuses and so on. And in many respects, as a student of history, I see it as a trajectory. And something that's been out there. Unfortunately, yeah, still going up. And we need to, and what I've always said, the response to it, by the way, and about 25 years ago, I gave us a high holiday sermon, and I talked about what is the greatest threat to Jewish survival. And in the first part of the sermon, I talked about anti-Semitism. And I said, but that's really not the greatest threat. I talked about assimilation as being an even greater threat. That still is a major problem and a major threat. In other words, assimilation where we lose our identity, where we don't observe and preserve Jewish practices and so on. I would not be able to give that sermon today, Artie, because, of all that's happening in that context.
I want to move on to your upcoming retirement. How real is your retirement in your mind now?
Well, I'm doing this, aren't I?
Still doesn't mean anything.
That's an interesting question. I have some ideas. I haven't, it's going to be different. It's going to be weird because, like, when I was in college, I should mention this. You were asking me that earlier question. So in my last year of college, I was the Director of State Affairs at the University of Maryland, which meant I was representing 30,000 students to the Maryland state government. I was on the phone with the governor, and I was like 20 years old at the time. And I was on the phone with the governor when there were disturbances on campus. I testified before committees, et cetera, as I mentioned. I didn't mention this, but I also was teaching in a religious school. Mm-hmm. I also was, at the time, we had a university senate at the University of Maryland. And I was elected through the university senate. They had standing committees. I was the only student to ever chair a university senate committee. It was the Judiciary Committee.
That's big.
And I had faculty members, I had administrators, and then there was me. And I was running this committee. I was 20. And in addition to that is when I was writing an honors thesis. And so in college, and the reason I mention this is because I still have like one of my date books from then, and it was so full. I was just a college kid. So my point is, I'm used to doing a lot and having my days very full.
Right.
So I'm gonna, have to figure out how to fill that time. But I have a few ideas. So
you're not going to be that retiree whose wife is going to have to say, find a hobby.
Exactly. Although she might say that. I don't know. I think, look, one of the things to navigate, I'll be very open and honest, as I always try to be, will be what would be an appropriate role for me in B'nai Tzedek. You asked before about the aspect of being the steward of it. One other thing I would add to it is, hopefully, what I've been able to do is to give a direction, so that things flow from there.
Right.
I've tried to create a congregation which would be warm and welcoming, and that people would be in that kind of a context. A congregation that's open to tradition. When I started B'nai Tzedek, I should mention this, if I go back a little bit.
Yep.
So one of the first things I did was I went and I met with all the rabbis in the area to let them know I was going to start a synagogue. And the reason I did that was because I realized, first of all, there's no such thing as a secret in the Jewish world, especially not that. And instead of getting a call from one of my colleagues and saying, Stuart, what's this I hear you're starting a synagogue in my backyard?
Like 5 families.
Exactly. I went in through the front door and I met with, and they were very appreciative of that and very supportive and helpful.
Right.
So I've always tried to do it that way. And as a conservative synagogue, I thought there was a place for a synagogue that would clearly be conservative, that would clearly be traditional and observant in that regard, et cetera, and yet still somehow be open to some of the things which the spirituality that I experienced in the Reform movement. So I've tried to create that kind of an atmosphere in our services, and hopefully it has flowed through. So when you talk about, the stewardship and that aspect of it,
right.
I've wanted to create that. So now, As we move forward, I'm very pleased that we have an interim rabbi who will be with us in the coming year.
Right.
Someone who's a colleague and a friend of mine. When I was in Bowie, he was in Greenbelt. I have
wow.
a great deal of respect for him, and I know him well. I think he's going to do a wonderful job. Just make sure he checks in with me a lot. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. So it's something to navigate because, as people say, Stuart, it's your baby, So I still want us to thrive. I still want us to succeed. I still want people to feel the connection. A synagogue, a rabbi is obviously the fulcrum and an important part of it. But at the end of the day, it's the congregation. You guys are going to have to figure this out and figure out how you continue together. And I'll be there to help. And I'll be there to be in whatever capacity will be appropriate for our congregation. I'm going to be trying to see how often to teach an occasional class or to be available for different things. And as I've said also, I've tried to give a mixed message. Usually people won't say, that in a positive way. And the mixed message I've tried to give, and I hope it's okay, is to say that I'm still, care about our members and our congregation. But by the same token, I want whoever's going to follow me to be recognized as the rabbi at that time.
Right.
And the reason for the first part is, and in many congregations, they say, that's it, you're done, go away. Or many rabbis say, that's it, I'm done, I'm going away. And to me, that means it was always just transactional. And it wasn't relationship based. And so there are so many wonderful relationships. I wouldn't want to just, say, that's it, right?
Right.
So to try and navigate that while there's a new person. And then the work that I'm doing with the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, maybe to have the opportunity to teach and speak a little bit more outside of our immediate community, to be able to write, some of those kinds of things. I think that's how I'll be filling some of my time in retirement.
Got it. I want to close with a couple of questions about spirituality. How do you define your relationship with God?
Who? No, I'm just kidding.
Always with the jokes.
I would have to say the following. There are times in which I feel very moved by the presence of God. Sometimes on the high holidays, sometimes in a service. Again, to be perfectly honest, sometimes as the leader of a service, you have to be worried about so many little things as well, logistically.
Logistics.
Yeah. So that sometimes can, get in the way a little bit of that spirituality. When I was with my family at the Grand Canyon, we woke up very early in the morning. We put on our talitot and tefillin, and we actually just did that not too long ago as well when we were out in West Virginia. Those are beautiful moments. One time when I was with a group of rabbis early in my career in the 80s, and I was privileged to be invited on a mission, and we were the first delegation of rabbis to visit Hungary since World War II.
Wow.
I also participated as the first group of rabbis to visit Germany since World War II. And in one of those two trips, I don't recall which one it was, the rabbis, we were in a airport. It may have been in Germany, it may have been in Hungary, and we were davening Shacharit with our tefillin in the middle of this, what at the time was a communist country, if it was Hungary, and in Germany if it was there. I don't recall which place it was. But at any rate, it was a connection. And part of what I want to say is, because of the regularity of davening and of knowing the tefillot, the prayers, and of doing that, it allows you to have those spiritual moments of highs. So the more direct answer to your question would be that I feel inspired. I pray every day. I hope for strength.
When you pray, do you feel like you're speaking to God?
Yeah. Look, when I went through my cancer treatments and everything, I really felt very much, I prayed intensely. I didn't always necessarily pray for healing. I prayed for the ability to be able to confront what I was doing. I tried to explain to God and say, I still have a lot of stuff I want to do. And I would say, and I want to do it for you. So, I guess it helped.
Okay.
One of our members once said, Stuart, with all the prayers everyone's saying for you, when I was going through my cancer treatments and all, they said, that's the medicine. The chemo you're getting, that's the supplement. And it was beautiful ways. And then the year after, again, one of those moments where I had a very honest line, most of it, I usually be honest most of the time, but a very maybe self-revelatory line. I said, I don't know if everyone remembers it or not, I said, there are times when I look back and I miss the intensity of the prayers that I had, that I expressed when I was going through cancer. Yeah.
You don't feel that you can recreate that?
It's hard. Yeah, it's hard.
All right, so the last thing I want to ask about
Yeah.
is, I'm a big baseball fan.
Totally.
And when I encounter other baseball fans, I love to ask, okay, you're commissioner for the day, what are you changing about baseball?
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to take that concept and bring it here. So God appears to you one day, and he gives you the opportunity to change one thing about Judaism.
Oh.
I mean, it could be anything, bacon, Passover down to 2 days, no fasting on Yom Kippur. What's that thing that you would change about Judaism?
Okay, before I answer that, since you mentioned about the baseball thing, I got to tell you one thing, because you talked about hitting a home run.
You noticed that?
Yeah, and I love that. We just went to a baseball game the other night, by the way, with the family. It was great. I'll tell you guys something, and that is when I stand here, and it's on the high holidays, and I get up and I see our congregation is overflowing, I often feel I'm stepping into the batter's box.
Yeah.
And my imagery is I want to hit a home run.
Yeah, I get it.
So it's funny that you use that baseball imagery. So if I could change any one thing about Judaism, what would I want to change? Maybe, obviously, I did not know these questions in advance. I wish there would be more Jews and less anti-Semitism. Does that work?
It's your answer.
Right, yeah. God would allow there to be more Jews, less persecution, less anti-Semitism, choose someone else for a little while, that whole kind of thing, yeah. Maybe I'll come back to you later with that.
Okay.
But
Fair
off
enough.
the top of my head, there's so much in Judaism that makes sense and that I love, and the rituals and the customs, the language. I mean, that's why, by the way, after this week, we're going to continue with several Thursday nights, and I'm going to do the last part of the series, which I started in the fall, called The 7 Things That I Most Love and Most Inspire Me About Being Jewish. And so one of them is going to deal with like culture and language and humor and other aspects, what I most love about being Jewish. So I'll think about it. I'll let you know. Come back next week. I'll see if I have an answer.
I just want to say to you personally that I'm really glad I had the opportunity to do this, and I hope it was revealing. That was the goal, to learn something. And I remember one of our conversations, and we were talking about our friendly relationship. And I said to you, and by the way, I may be one of the only people here who doesn't call you by your first name. I've never called you by your first name, just because I wasn't raised that way.
Yeah.
And we talked about having a friendly relationship, and I said to you, we do have a friendly relationship, but you're not my friend, you're my rabbi, which is more important. And I still feel that very strongly. And I'm glad I've had this opportunity here. I'm glad I've had the opportunity to be a member of B'nai Tzedek, because it's enriched my life. It's enriched my family's life. We did travel to Israel together all those years ago, and we both traveled recently, not on the same trip, but we both traveled recently. And I just want to say thank you maybe before some other people do, for everything you've done here. And that's why I wanted to ask you about being a steward of this place, because that word just resonated with me. So thank you for doing this.
Wow, thank you. Thank you,
appreciate
Artie. You did a great job. Thank you.
Hey. All right, we did good.
Yeah, thank you. Who knew? I'll just respond. There was a roast for Governor Marvin Mandel. I did his funeral a few years later, But at this particular roast for Marvin Mandel, he got up and he said, it was at the University of Maryland, and he said, because all these people had roasted him, and he said, gee, people are pretty nice. That's because the governor always gets the last word. And I got up right after him because I was doing the benediction, and I said, actually, Governor, the rabbi always has the last word. And what I said at the time was, because it was in the spirit of it being a roast, and if you may remember Governor Mandel, I said, one of the great things about him is that he always looked out for the little guy. I said, that's because he is a little guy. He's about this tall. So, I just want to comment on what you mentioned at the end there. It is interesting. There are some people who call me Rabbi and Stuart,
Right.
both interchange, different times. Some people who only call me Rabbi, and some people only call me by my first name. And so it often is a reflection on how comfortable a person is, where they are. And so I never insist one or the other. It has to be what somebody's comfortable with. But what it reflects sometimes is one thing that I do want to say, and that is that having lived my life as a rabbi, I would say, I mentioned earlier there were other options or other thoughts I had about what to do. I have absolutely no regrets. This has been such an amazingly rewarding and fulfilling life, and being able to be involved in people's lives in so many ways, and to be able to somehow do a little something towards what I set out and wanted to do when I was just in my early 20s and became a rabbi. However, having said that, there are aspects, and some of you, this may not come as a surprise, there are aspects of the rabbinate which can be very lonely for some of the very reasons that you mentioned. Lonely for me and or for my wife. I think my kids are okay. But aspects of, precisely because there are times when people have that barrier or distance, early on in my career, I did a wedding at the Watergate Hotel. This would have been in the early 80s, I guess. And it just so happens, since it was at the Watergate and we just got into Washington, I didn't really know the family that well, but I thought it'd be nice to stay for the reception. It was at the Watergate, et cetera, et cetera. And so I sat, they sat me at a table with this guy who, any of you who remember, there was a great invention in the 80s, which was the padded toilet seat. That you would sit on and it would kind of compress a little bit. Well, it just so happened I sat next to the guy who invented it.
Wow.
And this guy was this boisterous Jewish guy from Long Island.
Hey.
Sense of humor. Positive, great sense of humor, outgoing, and so on. And the funny thing was that people kept coming over to him every few minutes, and they would say to him, Uncle Mel, you're sitting next to the rabbi, be careful what you say. And I would say, let him speak, That's what I'm talking about in terms of how sometimes people feel that that distance, that barrier. Some people, will project that and so on. And so that's the part I think that's been most difficult, is in terms of being a rabbi, is that you want to be able to have that relationship. You asked what it was like when I was just Stuart Weinblatt, before being Rabbi Stuart Weinblatt. It's one of the reasons why, some of my closest friends come from before those days. Now, not to say that there aren't many wonderful close relationships and friendships that have developed over the years, but there are aspects in which sometimes people look at the rabbi and feel, and I recognize that and I accept it and I embrace it. When I was in rabbinical school, one of the things that we sometimes would talk about would be the nature of being a rabbi, and perhaps this would be a good note upon which to close before just thanking you. You've done a fantastic job. Can we just applaud Artie, by the way?
Thank you.
And I got to tell you, by the way, there are a ton more stories that I can share at some point if people are interested. Maybe we'll do a
Part two
at some point. But when I was in rabbinical school in my last year, and we were going to be applying for jobs and stuff like that, I hope everyone will stick around. We can schmooze a little bit more afterwards. We've got plenty of water out there. I don't know if we got anything else. So anyway, made a little coffee. But when I was in rabbinical school, one of the professors gave this piece of advice as we're going out to interview. And he said the important thing when you're interviewing for a job as a rabbi, he said the important thing, and I've tried to live by this, is to be yourself. And so I've tried to just be myself. I remember in my last year of rabbinical school, all of a sudden, one or two of the people in my class, they stopped talking like this, and suddenly began to speak
Like an
in
anchorman.
that rabbinic voice. Please be seated, and something. So anyway, so the advice that that we were given was to be yourself. And then he said, unless you're a schmuck, and then be someone else. So on that note, we end.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shalom Rabbi Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leo